Tav, you ready, sir?
Yep, I'm always ready.
All right. Good evening. This is Pepe Soto with the Air Force Circle Foundation for our third iteration of the book club. Today we're going to talk about Neil Sheehan's outstanding book. Can I get on screen? A Fiery Peace in a Cold War by Bernard Shriver and the Ultimate Weapon. This is a pretty fascinating book. I learned so much about the Air Force itself by reading the book. It's a great, I think, story about the Air Force, how it started off with, and uses British Shriver's life as kind of the thread through the story of the Cold War from World War II all the way up through the ICBM, through the space race and our first satellites. So along with General Holmes and myself, tonight we have with us Major General Tom Tav Taverny. Tav's a 1968 graduate of the Air Force Academy and has been involved in space operations and programs for over 38 years. And probably one of the best well-spoken and well-read and well-written airmen on space operations. So without further ado, Tav, I want to get over, sir, and tell us about the book and yourself.
Okay. I think anybody, every time you read this book, you're going to see things that are new in it. There are really two elements to succeeding in the space race. And that was getting an approach and getting a priority that would allow you to manage this program under non-standard rules. In doing that, General Shriver had some significant partners. The first and maybe the most important was John von Neumann, who, in order to make strategic missiles work, ICBMs, you had to be able to compress the size of a nuclear warhead. And so the first thing he did before he even said one word to anybody was visit John von Neumann, asked him if it was feasible to have a 1 megaton nuclear warhead compressed to 1,500 pounds. John von Neumann said it was. He followed up being on a lot of committees, giving Shriver's approach a lot of technical clout. And then in the political arena, there was Trevor Gardner and Vince Ford, the gray ghost, as they called him, the guy that worked everything behind the scenes, the guy that got Scoop Jackson involved. But Trevor Gardner, the wild Welshman, was very passionate. And with working with those three people, General Shriver was able to get this a national priority as the #1 program in the world. Getting to see the President of the United States on anything, then or now, is no small task. And they got to see him and they moved it to the #1 priority. Then the next most important thing that happened was the Gillette Committee. And Gillette formulated the Gillette procedures. And quite frankly, this is something we could do today. I don't see this being unobtainium. The things you can do to make the program go quickly. One of them was saying, instead of going through 20, 25 offices in the Air Force Secretariat and 20, 25 offices in the OSD Secretariat, we're going to put all those people on one committee, chaired by the SecAF on a Secretariat for the Air Force, and by the Secretary of Defense on the other Secretariat. So when you needed approval, you could go and only do 2 briefings. This was significant. It allowed him to do things very quickly, and immediately he got the approval, and he could go back to DC in 3 days instead of making 4 trips over a 6-week period to try to get all the approvals. But still, none of that would have worked. I'm going to put this back into Shriver's bucket. There's been a lot of talk. Could anybody else have done this but General Bernard Shriver? And no matter how you look at it, I'm not sure anyone else could have. He was a member of the greatest generation. He excelled in World War II. And the most significant mentor in his life was Hap Arnold. And Hap Arnold was a real advocate of that the Air Force was either going to be an Air Force of technology or going to fall behind. And so he kind of took up that thought and pushed that his entire life, and he did it with courage. So what did it take to be successful? Well, first, he had unbelievable courage. I know you read in the book, he was in this group trying to get Camp Cook, and it was a whole auditorium with 3 and 3-star generals. He's a 1-star general. And they said, we don't approve it. And he could have stopped and said, well, that's the way it goes. He said, no, you're all wrong. You know, a lot of people would think that's putting a bullet in your career, but he didn't care. He wanted to do the right thing. You're all wrong, and here's why. And he explained it to them. Before he left, he got the approval to get Camp Cook. He many, many times went head to head with General LeMay. In fact, after he was retired, one time General LeMay looked at him when they were at a function in uniform and said, you'd have never got those 4 stars if it was up to me. General Schriever said, yeah, I know. So he had to take on the bomber community led by General LeMay. So he had amazing courage and commitment to doing the right thing. The second thing he did, he chose the best people and empowered them. You know, generally people like that like to control everything. General Schriever felt his job was getting the right people, giving them the accountability and authority to do their job. And there's a lot of leaders around now that don't know how to do that. You know, even when they failed, like when Mettler and Thiel failed on the first Thor launch, they thought they were going to be fired. He said, no, just keep going. They failed on another and they failed on another till they finally got it right. When he was convinced he had the right person, he wasn't going to fire them for failure. He wanted them to take risks. He wanted them to do well. The other thing he did was, in those days, you used to pick a prime contractor to build everything. And he said the Air Force has to be in control, and I want the Air Force to make all the decisions, but I need a technical arm in order to give me the strength to do that. So out of that came what became early Ramo Wooldridge with Cy Ramo, and Cy Ramo became his right-hand man, and they together were closely, but it was never confusing to Cy Ramo what his job was. His job was to provide technical support and technical advice. They didn't make decisions. The Air Force people he put in charge made decisions. Another thing you can see about that, when you look at the people that work for them, they have to be 8 or 9 that went on to be 3-star general or higher. The other thing he did that, you know, some of the smaller contractors now that build Class C systems know how to do, which is schedule. Everything takes second place to schedule. Everything's subordinate to schedule. If you have decisions to make, schedule wins. You know, make compromises when you can, and I'll talk a little later about how we did that on Minuteman. The other thing, there's 2 very unique things that this organization came up with. Back in the 50s, configuration management was around, but it was for software. And Major Ben Bellis decided that configuration control could be equally applicable and just as important when you're building hardware. So he implemented the first space hardware program to implement configuration control. Another thing that they basically invented on the program was systems engineering. General Schriever believed if they were going to build a lot of complex systems and build these systems so that they worked, they need to know all the interfaces. They need to know how everything worked together. They needed some overriding construct, and that's systems engineering. I worry, even though we're going to model-based systems engineering, I still worry as we go to these automated systems that if we take the smart human out of systems engineering, we're making a mistake. Support him with automation, but as General Schriever would say, let's do the right systems engineering to get this to work. Another concept he had, which no one would agree to anymore, was a thing called concurrency. He said it's the only way to meet a fast schedule. If you have 8 technology areas, you run along all 8 at the same time. Today, we try to pick the highest risk, drive down the risk, then pick the next highest risk, drive down the risk. It becomes more serial. He pushed the technology across all the technological elements of the system simultaneously. And where that was never shown any better was in Minuteman. The first time Minuteman launched any kind of test, it was a full-up Minuteman. They brought that system together using systems engineering, configuration management, built it. The first time they launched, it was a full-up system, and it worked. And then the other thing he did, which I know you can't do anymore, the fighter pilot world used to do it too, when they'd hire 2 guys to build an airplane and then have them fly off and pick one. Congress would never buy this anymore, but you know, he did. General Schriever said, you know, we're going to develop Atlas, that's probably not the ultimate system. So I need to be developed Titan at the same time. Ultimately, even after those two, he said, neither of those are the right operational system. I need to develop Minuteman. And he sold all that because he knew he was technically right. He was an amazing guy. Everybody that worked for him idolized him. And the proof obviously is in the pudding, right? We built, we built Titan in 22 months. We built Thor in 17 months. We built Minuteman in 30 months. And we built, simultaneously, he was also building the first space-based imaging system. He built that in 27 months. And so he made the schedule. He made all this stuff work. He had 5 simultaneous and Thor he did in 17 months. So he did 5 major systems with a very small organization supported by aerospace, obviously with a unique set of rules, but with his management concepts overlaid. And we wouldn't have won the Cold War without him.
Thank you, sir. General Holmes, over to you, sir.
Thanks, Tab. That's an amazing story, and Neil Sheehan tells it well. And thank you for giving us the highlights of it. You know, I love this book. I came to it when I was the vice commander at Air Education and Training Command. I had orders to do a deep dive into the missile air organization and the ICBM setup. And it really helped me understand the background and the history behind it when I was traveling around to every base and interviewing all the leadership teams. But there's a backstory to me in the book that also talked to me then as I ended up being the A8 for the Air Force and planning budgets, which is, how do you introduce something new? How do you successfully introduce a new capability into a large organization like the Air Force? And I'd summarize that part of the story like this, that the colonels and generals in the Army Air Corps at the start of the war, you know, were the 4-star generals at the end of the war. And they beat Germany and they beat Japan as part of a coalition. When they looked forward to becoming a separate service, which they had earned, they really could only envision doing the same things that they had done to beat Germany and Japan, but with bigger airplanes that went faster and higher and bigger bombs. And they were able to advance the idea of replacing our forces with airplanes and nuclear weapons. And I would say with unreliable nuclear weapons on unsafe airplanes, which led to dropping weapons all around the world in different places. But guys like Schriever, who was, a lieutenant between the wars and grew up to be a colonel at the end of the war. And there were a whole lot of guys like him, the guys that were the cadre of pilots and leaders that trained in the 20s and 30s and were available to start building the organization. They fought just as hard in World War II. They were valorous. They led the charge at the operational level, but they weren't as attached to it. And so they could envision a new way to do things. They came home and got degrees in new fields like system engineering, and they could imagine a better way to put those unreliable nuclear warheads, down in a hole somewhere where they weren't as big a threat to the world until you needed them, and to give a responsive force without airborne alert. So it made me kind of think about, so how does that process work? And when are you successful and when are you not? And I looked at kind of Billy Mitchell and the initiation of air power. I thought about this case, and then I thought about the air power moment at the end of Desert Storm when everybody thought, hey, this has been proven. Air power is a dominant force on the modern battlefield, and we should, continue to build the force to do that. And my kind of generalizations are that, what it takes is it takes a new idea. And then, for Mitchell's case, it was the airplane. In this case, it was the ICBM with nuclear weapons to do deterrence. For the Gulf War period, it was probably, advanced platforms with precision weapons. Although, in the Gulf War, only about 10% of the bombs that were dropped were precision weapons. And the airplanes that we had were the ones that were developed for the Cold War. But there was something new there between stealth and precision weapons. then it has to be exemplified in a person or person. So in Air Power moment, it was Billy Mitchell. In this moment, it's hard for us to believe, but General Schriever was on the cover of Time magazine more than once. He was a very famous public figure. People talked about him and his ideas. He took his argument public. So it has to be wrapped around a person. At the end of that Air Power moment, there was no single person really that embodied it all. There was a little John Warden, there was a little Dave Deptula, there was a little Chuck Horner. There were a whole lot of people, but there was no one idea or one person to bring it in. And then the third thing I found is you have to have direct access into the levers of power in the government. Billy Mitchell's dad was a senator. He could walk into Congress and get into anybody's office and talk directly to people when he needed to. General Schriever was able to work that von Karman connection and others to get directly in front of the president and to take his argument to a president who was looking for a new way to defend the country at lower cost and found a receptive audience. And I used to stop at those three, but then I've kind of added a fourth one, which is you need to face a strong peer competitor that's recognized by the country as a threat. Billy Mitchell, for having a new idea personified in him and with access to the halls of power, he still got court-martialed, and we didn't really build an Air Force until Germany built a giant threat to the world and invaded Europe, and now all those things came together in a threat. General Schriever had an existential threat in the Soviet Union, and so he had that step. And for the Air Force in that Air Power moment, not really having a direct connection into the halls of power, but also in a time that we were talking about peace dividends and not additional spending, those things didn't come together. So, what I learned from this book was the steps that General Schriever used to try to drive change, and a little bit about what it takes to try to do that in a broader context. Now, for my generation, the guys that I grew up with, if we weren't careful, what we did, like the World War II leaders did, is we saw Desert Storm as kind of the model to build everything on. You deploy advanced platforms with well-trained crews and qualified maintainers. You'd have time to do a run through and work through it, and you would control all that power from an air operations center. And so if you brought us a problem, that's how we wanted to handle it. And that may have made us resistant to adding new ideas beyond those things. Then for the generation served now, it's been 20 years of chasing violent extremists around, largely with the Air Operations Center being replaced by a strike cell, and with operations CAS and dynamic targeting largely under the control of an Army ground commander. And so what paradigm do they take as they go forward? And we as a group have to try to relearn the lessons that it takes to deter or defeat a peer adversary. So future air and space forces, future air and space leaders, I think, can learn a lot from this book and from General Schriever. And at the Air Force, Historical Foundation, we want to spread things like that, spread the ideas that worked, help people understand what works, so that air forces and space forces can continue to control and exploit the air as our country depends on them to do. So I think the book is two great stories. One out front that tells the story of how we got ICBMs with nuclear weapons, and then this other idea of what it takes to generate change. Thanks, Pepe.
Thank you, sir. I have a question for both of you as to talk to Q&A. So for Taff and for General Holmes, given today's version of the Cold War 2.0, what are the key lessons we can learn from what our Air Force did in the first Cold War that we can take into today's crisis with Russia and China? Sir, Tav, you want to take a stab at that?
Yeah, honestly, I think we're kind of where we were when General Schriever came on board. While we did have the superior technology capabilities, but we had, after World War II, we'd spent so much money. We're in a world of budget austerity. General Eisenhower wanted everything cut. Wasn't interested in spending money. Thought rockets were interesting, but not worth spending money on. And so we started from a position of not having enough money to do the things we probably should have been doing. The other thing that's similar is that the Russians in August of '67 I mean, in August of 57, before Sputnik, fired a nuclear missile. The government knew about it, but the public didn't. And then Sputnik came in 57, the public knew about it. And so that piece was really well known. And so that's kind of hyped up where we're going to go from a budget point of view. And I think a similar thing happened now when all of a sudden Russia and China started demonstrating hypersonic missiles and robust, scary offensive space capabilities. And while we certainly have the technology to be equal or better than them, they demonstrated it first. You know, the Russians were the first to put a guy in orbit, the first to put a satellite in orbit, the first to put a woman in orbit, the first to get to Mars, the first to get to the moon not with people, but to get to the moon. And so we started off with a perceived position of being behind. And that was the impetus that led to the Space Force, which I think is a good thing, because having an organization that has people that go to bed at night, wake up in the morning, only thinking of their environment, that was a rationale for the Air Force. And the Army were not good stewards of air leading into World War II. I think we had 6,600 planes leading into World War II. During World War II, we built like 250,000, not just for us, but for our allies. And so an impetus made a change. And I think in this case, space, you know, Sputnik and the RR-7 tests led to a change. In this case, I think hypersonic glide and hypersonic missiles and offensive space capabilities led to a change. And so in that way, I think we're similar.
General Holmes, any comments, sir?
Well, I would throw on there from rereading the book and from listening to Tav, I would say having acquisition processes that are built for speed. Right now, our acquisition processes are built for oversight, accountability, and fairness to contractors. And so it looks like we're willing to give up speed and rapid capability gain in exchange for those things. And we're going to have to reevaluate that if we want to take old, outdated forces and perhaps driven by old, outdated ideas and drive to the new next thing.
And that's thing I think I read in a book is the confrontation between LeMay and Schriever on ICBMs versus bombers. You know, the Russians already were doing standoff with the ICBM concept before we were actually bringing it on board as a strategy. But today with hypersonics, and this is what you brought up, Tav, how do we take the new hypersonics arms race? How does that match against what Schriever did with ICBMs and the Russians? Is there any kind of connection there, or things we can learn from what Schriever did ICBMs as we go to perceive that we're behind in hypersonics? Tav?
Yeah, you know, the issue with hypersonics, and a lot of people think it's speed. It's not. It's that they fly low, 60,000 feet or lower, which is deep in Earth clutter, and they maneuver. So you have to be able to see them in clutter, relatively dim target, looking in clutter that's bright, be able to pick out a moving target. And then when they maneuver, you have to recalculate the tracks. So they're a challenging problem. You know, building a strategic missile is a challenging problem. I mean, the U.S. has, you know, I think Congress is frustrated with the speed we go at. You know, one of the reasons that Space Development Agency is doing well, because they're a schedule first, just like Schriever was. And it's not the fault of the acquisition it's not the fault of the acquisition people, which it's always easy to blame. It's the fault of the rules, like General Holmes said. You cannot build a system fast with today's rules. It just can't be done. There's just too many things you have to do. It's 2 years just to get an AOA and an approved program. And then Congress laid this silly thing on it called Program of Record that happened back in the Sybers days. I mean, that was never institutionalized. And so now if you're pursuing a program and you need to make a change, it takes you months and months and months and months to make a change. So the system is not set up today. As we know, they set up a speed with Schriever. SDA is trying to do that and demonstrate it, but obviously Congress and OSD and everybody else is going to have to buy into those changes. They have not yet. They just keep saying go faster, but the tools to go faster aren't there except for the RCO, AFWorks, and SDA.
And even when Space Force wants to bring in some new concepts, you know, you talked about hypersonic missiles and the problems we have in tracking them. If they argue to replace our historical overhead persistent infrared system with the new orbitology and new concept that would let you do that, they're face to face with all the money that would be spent on replacing the legacy system and which district that'll be spent in and who that money will be donated to. And so there's resistance to going ahead with the new approach.
You both talked about the problems we have with contractors and with the Congress. And when I'm reading the book, it appears to me that the military industrial complex we have today was kind of built by Schriever and all those, and then TRW, and developing the ICBM to meet that race pace. Is there a way that we can possibly, as we move towards a more agile, as we want a more agile acquisition process, a way that we can kind of re-wicker this industrial complex the way it is today, or is that just going to be a bridge too far for us with the way laws are today for competition and such with industry?
No, I think you can always depend on industry to do what it takes to win programs and make money. And so if the government doesn't change the processes and procedures, there's no incentive for contractors to do it. There's no contracts and incentivized schedule. They incentivize a lot of testing. They incentivize lifetime testing. They encourage the opposite of Schriever is that no failure is an acceptable failure. So they don't encourage the ability to go fast, make a mistake, fix it, and go forward. So I think contractors will react to whatever the government wants to buy and the way they want to buy it. So if the government actually changes the rules, I think contractors will change with them. They're all in this to make money for their shareholders. So I don't think it's the contractors. I think it's the infrastructure, excuse me, the infrastructure that sits that people don't want to change because change is hard.
Yeah, one of the things I've learned late in my life, because I wasn't, didn't spend a lifetime in acquisition, was that American problems, the solutions to American problems, somebody has to make money at it. There has to be a way to drive that solution to make money at it. That's the way our markets and that's the way our system is set up. And that's great because it's been able to bring capabilities that nobody else could have. And the kind of defense companies that it takes to build the sophisticated systems, an ICBM, a nuclear aircraft carrier, a nuclear submarine, an F-22 and F-35, linked AI-driven companion combat aircraft. It's not those things, that integration are hard to do, and it takes a special kind of company to do it. And I agree with Tav. We can find a model that will still allow those special kinds of companies to thrive. They'll react to it.
Awesome. Tav, due to your comments, you brought the fact of the problems that he had with Curtis LeMay. It seems that LeMay was always kind of in his way throughout his career, but throughout his career, as he tried to get things done, he always confronted stronger, powerful general officers or civilians. What gave him the gumption or the courage of conviction to always do the right thing in the face of overwhelming stress and powerful people in his way? I mean, to me, that was an extraordinary part of the person. Was he was very, don't want to say single focus minded, but he knew what he'd rather do was right than not upset the boat. What was about him that made him do that, sir?
Well, he had some really great mentors. He had his mother, who was a very strong woman who lost her husband, who set up a lemonade and sandwich stand to help him survive, who, when that was forced out of business, she put him in an orphanage until she could get a job and get enough money to bring them back. So he had a mother who was a great mentor. He had George Kenney, who I know, it's not just, everybody that's ever worn a blue uniform knows George Kenney, one of the greatest airmen that ever lived. One of my favorite stories about George Kenney is when he kept getting overruled on what he was doing by MacArthur's chief of staff. He walked into his office with a piece of paper. He held that piece of paper, took a pencil and put a dot on it. He said, "You see that dot? That's what you know about air power. You see the rest of the white paper? That's what I know about air power. So get out of my way." So George Kenney did not let people stand in his, he was very much that kind of guy. And I know Schriever learned a lot from him, learned a lot from Ennis the Menace Whitehead, who was a hard guy, but fair, even though he drove for perfection. He learned a lot from his father-in-law, George Brett, but mostly he learned from Hap Arnold, who was a role model that I wish we all had. So he was a guy that had a vision of the future, knew he had to go to that future, was willing. He supported Billy Mitchell back when everybody told him he was going to end his career. He said, I don't care. Billy Mitchell's right. And he went and supported them, and they tried shoving him off to nothing, ending his career. He ended up being a star. So Hap Arnold was a phenomenal role model. George Kenney, his mother. I think he just saw those role models along the way.
General Holmes, any comments or thoughts?
Well, Tav is doing a great job, and man, I sure am glad he's here. I would say that, in every career in the Air Force, there comes a point where you're up against a decision of, is your job to try to guess what your boss wants and give that to him, or is your job to try to, do the right thing for your airmen? And if you live through the Great Depression and you live through, multiple years of war with Japan, and you built an Air Force out in the middle of nothing and worked through that, you come back home and you kind of say, what are they going to do to me? If this doesn't work out, I'm going to do the right thing. With just a short bit of mentoring here, for me, it was when the Air Force, I thought as a new colonel, I was pretty sure the 18th Operations Group at Kadena had my name on it. It all made sense to me. And the Air Force sent me to a pilot training group. And I was pretty sure the Air Force was telling me, hey, thanks a lot, Mobile, but we're about done with you. And I pouted for a little bit. And then my boss said, hey, instead of pouting, why don't you go down there and try to be the best pilot training group, commander that you can be. And what I found was deciding you're in your last assignment was a pretty powerful thing for me. It was, if this is my last time, then I'm not going to try to guess. I'm going to try to do what I think is best. For weapons school guys, it's kind of like, if I'm going to bust this ride, I'm not going to bust it because I guessed wrong on what my AP wanted me to do. I'm going to figure out the best plan I have, and I'm going to go try to do it. And, what I found was that the Air Force kept giving me one more last job after that over and over. And I think that's an important thing to take. And guys like Schriever made those decisions as teenagers often because of the life that they grew up in.
Awesome. One thing you both touched on was the men that worked for Schriever and their backgrounds that were incredible. That was part of the greatest generation. And the book does a great job of telling each one's stories. I mean, the one guy who flew C-47s on night before D-Day and did the route twice to make sure the Pathfinder's in the right place, got a Silver Star in DFCs. All these guys were incredible airmen in combat. But what amazed me is after the war, they came back and got technical degrees to become experts in areas that the Air Force starting to grow. This is going to be a weird question to ask you, but in today's Air Force, it seems every officer has to have a master's degree. But back then, they picked degrees that were actually beneficial towards the mission. How can we in the Air Force today rewicker it so our guys actually look going for degrees that aren't just square fellow degrees, the ones that actually go towards building a better Air Force? And we look at like cyber and space itself. Those are two high technical areas where you have to have a strong technical background, understand all the math and science behind it. How do we build our generation of leaders? Because these guys all became generals and have that technical expertise to take us to that next level. The way Schriever brought those young majors and colonels up. Any thoughts on that?
Well, I think it was even bigger than Schriever. Following World War II, we learned lessons from World War I, where all our soldiers came back from World War I, and all of that unemployment, there were no programs for them. All that unemployment basically helped lead to a depression. After they came home from World War II, one of the things they set up was the GI Bill. And those people coming home from World War II, because there weren't going to be a lot of jobs, they went off and got technical degrees. We actually grew the Apollo program on them. We grew 400,000 engineers that supported the Apollo program. And so all of those young, sharp guys that were basically working, not only flying, but working the technical engineering problems of how do you do base jumping? How do you set up a base? How do you defend a base? How can you fly your airplane to get a little bit extra out of the fuel so I can skip an island? The people that saw that and saw those skills were critical during World War II came home and got engineering degrees. And so we grew a whole generation. I mean, again, we always say it's the greatest generation, and it was. Nowadays, 25% of our college graduates have STEM degrees. If you look at China and Russia, Russia has 60% that has STEM degrees. China has 67%. India has 60-some% that get STEM degrees. They graduate more engineers than we graduate graduates. And so we are in a different place today than we were then, and sadly, war probably had a lot to do with it, because these guys saw the value of building technical degrees. And we went from a manufacturing country to a country of innovation. So that manufacturing might we had, we turned it into innovation by that whole generation, the greatest generation that took us through that.
Yeah, very
Awesome.
well said. And there's some ideas I think out there that should be shared. I had an electrical engineering degree. It took me 6 years to get done my undergraduate degree, 6 years of college down the drain. But, I always found it very helpful as a weapons officer to be able to understand how the weapons worked and how the radar worked, and then be able to try to explain that to people so they could build that into their tactics and plans. I also sit on the Air Force Studies Board, and we had a discussion in a board meeting there about 10 days ago. And one of the participants said, part of the problem in the Air Force is we don't have enough senior leaders with technical degrees. They can't evaluate and decide between options or confidently, assess what's the right way to go. And I was probably one of the ones that pushed back. I'm not sure I handled that all that well. I pointed back to some problems on the acquisition system and some other things. But we continued to talk, and it came around to the idea of the impact of the loss of systems command to the Air Force, where systems command started with a group that looked at the threat. They worked that through into, okay, what's a concept that can defeat that threat? What technologies are out there that might be useful? Let's put that together. Now we're going to work through and we're going to acquire a platform or a system to solve that problem. Let's go acquire it. And within those teams, those program offices, there were technical guys, acquisition guys, contractors, and operators working together to solve the problem. And now we've kind of spread all that out and broken it up into little pieces to where, you may not get an operator's hands on something until it gets out of developmental tests and into operational tests, and find out, well, it works, but it doesn't do what we wanted it to do. It doesn't help us solve a problem. So we certainly need more STEM graduates. We certainly need a way to convince our young folks that that's a good place to go. And we also need to think about, in the Air Force, how many do we have, but also how do we put them together to make the most use out of them.
And that brings my next question, sir. A great segue with that. Thanks, General Holmes. Is Theodore von Karman. I found him to be a amazing personality in this book. I never heard about him before until I read this book, and he just was a fascinating personality. But I never heard about his paper, Science, the Key to Air Supremacy, until I read this book. And I think I told you in an email, I contacted about 20 O6s and a few GOs about, have you ever read this paper by von Karman? And only one person read it, and that was at SAS 30 years ago. But what got me was the key quote was, the paper was this: the men in charge of future air forces should always remember that problems never have final or universal solutions, and only a constant inquisitive attitude towards science and a swift adaptation to new developments can maintain the security of this nation through world air supremacy. That's a pretty powerful quote when we talk about air power and the use of science to drive air power. For both of you, does that quote still hold true today? That science should be driving air power as well as space powered, Tav?
Well, you're always chasing the next threat. And so one of the things that General Holmes talked about was how non-responsive our acquisition system is to changing threats. And I think any system you build now needs to be agile to changing threats. We need to put more processing power on our spacecraft and allow them to be reprogrammed on orbit, so that when a new threat comes up, we don't have to build a whole new system. We need to be able to build things faster. In the case where we need new technology, we need to be able to fast and be able to do rapid launch and insertion to orbit. But it's just the scale about how that happens. In the old days, the scale was maybe 10 years. where these big changes came. Now the scale is probably 2 or 3 years. And so we have to operate, as a pilot would say, inside that, you got to turn inside your adversary when you're in a dogfight. If we can't turn inside from a technological point of view, we can't turn inside the Russians and the Chinese, then General Holmes would tell you we're going to lose the dogfight. And so we need to find a way to be more agile, be able to be responsive, and never believe the solution we're putting up on orbit's the solution that'll last for very long.
Thanks,
There
General
are,
Holmes.
yeah, there are some guys thinking about some new approaches to doing that. And, you know, of course, it's pretty funny that as Tav explained, the ICBM process, what they're talking about is kind of a return to the future. So the idea is to build an environment that supports and encourages continuous innovation instead of building a platform and then building the ecosystem to support it, to build that architecture or environment so that you can continuously plug the latest platform or the latest sensor or the latest tactic into it. Dan Patt and Brian Clark at the Hudson Institute have a paper out that talks about ways to do that. And they kind of come back to, hey, the program office needs a support contractor that can provide technical expertise, but not make decisions and is not vested in which in-game platform is going to get selected. So we've handed off most of those decisions in the past to a prime that was also building the main platform. And so, you know, they have a vested interest in building the whole thing. Pat and Dan and Brian are proposing, you know, some different kind of companies that have expertise like Aerospace did or like TRW brought that can work for the program office to help them build that environment so that you can plug in platforms and sensors that are built by the kind of complex, sophisticated companies that it takes to build that. And I think that's a discussion we need to have.
Totally agree. And here's my next question. You talked about the threat, Tav, a few minutes ago. The one thing this book kind of points out, especially towards the end of the book, is that how, well, even with Stalin, how we always had misconceptions about the Russians and the threat itself. Even towards the end, when Khrushchev was lying about how many ICBMs we had, and he kind of made up the ICBM gap and the missile gap and caused that whole proliferation developing ICBMs quickly for us, which benefited Schriever a lot of ways. Seems we've always gotten the Russians and Chinese wrong on the threat for some reason. Sir, General Holmes, in the 80s, we were both, you know, in the 80s, thought the Russians were 10 feet tall. And the 90s came about, we found out they weren't. And the current fight's kind of showing that they're not 10 feet tall either. How can we get a better gauge of the threat from a geopolitical standpoint, as well as actual military standpoint, to really gauge on what they really are able to do, vice building the altitude solution to fight something that probably may not be there? Tav?
I think with the infrastructure put in by the NRO, and even more importantly, what commercial companies are doing in space-based ISR and visible SAR systems, RF systems, ELINT systems, and hyperspectral systems, I think the ability to hide your technology advances is gone. So the question is really going to be, in today's world, they can't hide that from us anymore. It's like fighting battles back in the old days. You know, getting intelligence on your enemy was the key to winning. It's always one of the keys to winning. So nowadays, it's hard to hide anything from anybody. The U.S. can't hide it from China. China can't hide it from the U.S. You know, China did that suborbital hypersonic demonstration. We saw it because we have plenty of satellites up there looking. And so the countries are not going to be able to build that capability and test it without us knowing it's coming. The question is, how do we react to it? Do we say, you know, the systems we're building now can handle it when they really can't, or some modification to it, or an ECP? You know, how do we react to those changes in new and flexible ways? And I think that's one of the things that General Holmes pointed out about how archaic the acquisition system is to be handling today's world, which is we can see these threats pretty close to real time. The question is, do we have the infrastructure in the US to handle that and respond to it? I think that's the bigger question. And thus far, even though the Russians and the Chinese have demonstrated this, we have not solved that problem, I don't believe.
Concur. Sure. Any comments, thoughts, General Holmes?
Well, I'll agree that, we think we have a pretty good understanding of, say, J20 and PL15, right? It may be that there are things there that we don't understand as well, but we think we have a pretty good understanding of how they plan to use that system to fight. And yet, we drug our feet on developing the things to try to, put our aircrew members back in a place where they have a comparable first look, first shot advantage. So some of it is understanding, and some of it is, again, lack of recognition of a peer threat to us and what that means if we lose. I go back to von Karman. I do believe that controlling the air and controlling the space is the key to providing defense for us, an island nation that's not attached to the Eurasian continent, with friendly neighbors north and south largely, and giant oceans east and west. To control the air and space is critical to everything we do. I played in a war game with CNAS and Meet the Press, and it was largely a air superiority struggle over the Taiwan Straits. Now, that air superiority struggle included using submarines to sink Chinese ships that brought surface to air missiles that would keep our air power out. But we're going to have to invest the intellectual effort and the time and the acquisition effort and the training effort and the money to make sure that we can continue to control and exploit air and space if we're going to deter attacks against our country.
We have about 28 folks out there in the field. Any questions from the audience you want to ask Tav and General Holmes? Anybody out there? Open up to questions.
I have a question.
Shoot, Michael.
If not for Ed Hall, would Bernard Schriever have had the reputation that he has? In other words, with just Atlas and Titan as our ICBMs, would we still have called him the progenitor of the ultimate weapon?
Well,
Good
there's
question,
a little
Pat.
bit of telling the future in that I'm not sure I could do. Certainly, we would not. I mean, Minuteman, it was the weapon we needed from the beginning. And I think Schriever knew that. I mean, certainly Ed Hall was absolutely brilliant. I mean, it was his engine that was used on both the Thor and the Titan. But we grew a pretty good industry with Aerojet and Rocketdyne. Could they have helped do this without Ed Hall? Maybe it would have taken them longer. So Ed Hall certainly was the reason we developed things that fast. He was brilliant, and he was a critical element of success, but he probably wasn't the only element of success. And could we have got there without him? We don't know, but there were some pretty good rocket guys out there. JPL was building the JATO-assisted solid rocket engines. Now, they didn't have the size or ISP necessary. The idea for the Star to burn the propellant was basically a British idea. So could we have got there? I suspect we could have. Could we have got there as fast? Maybe not. But there's no doubt that Ed Hall, his name is in every Space Force Hall of Fame that I know. He's in the Space and Missile Pioneers Hall of Fame. His name was in the first class of people who went on the SEC Wall of Fame. I think everybody recognized what a phenomenally significant person he was. But could we have done it without him? I don't know, but I suspect we could have. It might not have been as fast.
Part of the benefit of that deep dive I got to do into our ICBM enterprise was to make sure I understood that, miniaturizing a nuclear weapon was really important. Getting through liquid propellant missiles down to solid propellant to be able to store there for a long time safely was really important. But this whole giant infrastructure of silos and crew command capsules and the command and control and codes and everything that it takes to make it reliable and safe is a giant enterprise, like no other. I recently got to stand in one of the old Atlas sites.
Wow.
And, with a giant elevator that brings the Atlas up from underground so you can fuel it above ground and launch it. And you think how fast that was done and all the time that went into it. So there certainly were key contributors, in areas, but there are so many areas that had to be done. Somebody made the remark while we were there, how brave these men were and their families to live somewhere close to these sites that they knew were targeted by Russia. And, my response was, I don't think they were worried about getting killed by Russians. They were worried about getting killed by this Atlas in this hole in the ground here, or getting it ready. It's an amazing story.
Awesome. Any more questions out from the field, please?
I had a question.
Go ahead, Rock.
So for Tav, sir, I wondered what your thoughts were on deterrence in a new multipolar world. I was really intrigued by the book where you talked about Stalin and all the misreads of territories he would involve. So are there any lessons learned we can take from the past to apply to now to be more objective when we're doing our assessments?
Well, we have a data-rich intelligence environment now. We collect all sorts of data, maybe more than we can even handle. So the question is, that I think the next big path forward is how we can somehow get all that data, some of which just falls on the ground, and do fusion and assessments automatically, as AI comes along. I think, that's the next big rock. So are there things going on that we don't know about? Probably. Are there things going on that we haven't collected data on? Probably not. So how do we find a way to exploit the data that's collected to allow us not to be fooled by like Khrushchev's wild assertions, Stalin's quiet, everybody, certainly the Air Force thought he was going to be building bombers and he had no intention of it. So, you're right, but we do have data. The question is, how do we exploit that data to make it useful to actually provide information and intelligence?
Any thoughts, General Holmes, or comments on that, sir?
I think there's 21st century deterrence will be something different. It's certainly still going to need nuclear weapons, but I think there's also components in cyber, at least in economics and conventional forces. And I think that's a ripe field for people who want to think and write about what actually does 21st century deterrence means. The administration's, white paper on the subject is integrated deterrence that tries to bring all the tools of the nation together to do it. There's work to do to decide which are the most useful tools there and what are the affordable tools and how can we provide deterrence without going bankrupt in the process.
Any more questions in the field?
So
I got a few-
in
Go
regards
I have
to-
an observation, not necessarily a question.
Okay.
This is Larry Benson here. I did a book review of the Neil Sheehan book back 12 years ago, and you guys have done a great job of covering it. But there's one thing that Neil didn't have room for or time for, and that's Bernard Schriever's time at 7 years as commander of Air Force Systems Command. And there's a lot of stories left to be written there, I think, especially since it coincided with the McNamara era. And I hope there's some young officer who wants to do a paper on that someday. And because I'm sure there's still a lot of material in the Air Force archives, a lot of oral history interviews of Schriever that would be helpful in that endeavor. That's my one comment about the otherwise very good book. And of course, it would have been impossible to cover all of that in the amount of time that Neil Sheehan had. Thank you.
I would say I was lucky to be at General Schriever's, one of his 90th birthday celebrations here in LA. And that is something he opined on, is that he believes the McNamara era of trying to apply mathematical analysis to military functions and what should be funded hurt our country in a bad way. And he did not agree with most of what was going on then. He tried fighting it with courage, just like he always did, but he didn't win many of those wars. McNamara did.
Awesome. So we got a couple of questions to wrap things up with for both Tav and General Holmes. And one is, what do you think General Schriever will think about the establishment of a separate space force today? Tav?
I guess I think he'd be excited. I think, you know, for what it's worth, he's the father of all of this. He's the father of all things space in the Department of Defense. And so he would be considered the father of the Space Force. When Space Command was founded and we got our first badges, General Lord, as you saw in the book, I actually happened to be stationed up there at the time. He got badge 1 and took it back to give it to General Schriever. And General Schriever wasn't speaking in those days, but he had the biggest grin, he said. So I think he probably would have thought this was unobtainium in his life. I think he would have felt like he was a great, significant player in it, and he was.
General Holmes?
Here. And, I just weigh in here with the task that General Raymond and the Space Force leaders have. Imagine if Hap Arnold and crew had tried to create a separate institutions of a separate service during World War II, instead of building that giant capability and then building the institutions that it takes, being able to do it sequentially. Our Guardian brothers and sisters are trying to do both at once. They're trying to develop the capabilities we need in a new space arms race while they're creating a service at the same time. And my hat's off to them.
Another question I have is real quick is that, to me, she was probably one of the most greatest airmen our Air Force ever had, easily on a Mount Rushmore of airmen, history of the Air Force. Engineer, scientist, technologist, tactician, test pilot, acquisition master. Team builder, visionary. But it seems not that celebrated in the Air Force. It's about outside of space as he should be. I guess why is that? Is that some that we stick on for history, that this guy touched the Air Force in so many ways, in so many different areas, and culminating in the ICBM force we have today? That's the hallmark of the world. But to me, I don't see these. He's talked about and he's not. People know who he is, but not all he's done. So I guess my takeaway from the book itself. So I was just amazed everything he had. It's like General Doolittle covered so much stuff in a lifetime. His career covered so much ground, was amazing to me.
Right. If he'd stayed in the air business, I think he would have made a significant impact in the air business too, because he was obviously brilliant at that. So, he was just a unique guy that was going to come out and make a difference wherever he went. The people in the space world are lucky he chose our field. And he may not be recognized elsewhere, but he was the first living person to have an Air Force base named after him at Schriever. I think he knew what the people in the space community thought of him.
General Holmes, any
Well,
thoughts?
I just say that's part of our job in the Air Force Historical Foundation, is to try to help our airmen, know and understand the legacy of great leaders in air and space that have come in front of them and what they can learn from them and how it fits.
Let's wrap up the hour. I have a final question for both of you. What do you think are the key takeaways for today's airmen about General Schriever's story? Tav?
Well, we could start this whole thing again and have another hour, but I think General Schriever, of the critical things he did was he had the courage of his convictions. He had no problem telling people. Now, he wasn't obnoxious about it. If they told him to do something else, like they did frequently, he'd go off and do it. But he believed passionately in what he thought was right and followed what he thought was right. And that's hard to do for some young guys to walk in the 05 or 06 office and say, "Sir, I think we're doing this wrong." So I think if anything they can pull from General Schriever is, if you think it's the right thing to do, don't be afraid to carry that and say it, because he never was.
Awesome. General Holmes, sir?
I'll say here to that, and I'll use my last minute to thank people for joining us. Thank people for your questions here. Special thanks to Tav. But if you're new to us here, this is not our usual format. We usually have a lot more time in questions because we usually have the author of the book with us. Mr. Sheehan passed since the book was published, and so he couldn't be here with us tonight. But we usually get a lot more audience participation than this. So if you thought we should have had more to that, come join us anyway next time. But thanks to everyone who made this happen, particularly Pepe, you and your team that do the admin and the legwork to make it happen.
Thank you, sir. So that's been an hour and a clock, and that's calling time for tonight. So Joan Travers, sir, thank you for great insights and thoughts about General Shriver and Nicole and the ICBM and space, sir. I learned a lot tonight by myself on listening to both General Holmes talk and Mobile, sir, as always, sir. Thank you for all your great insights from all your years too. It was just a great session. Everybody, please join us in 2 months in August. Next book is Every Man a Tiger by General Chuck Horner, and he'll be speaking to us. And the anniversary of Desert Shield started in August of that year. So without any further ado, everyone have a good night, and we'll talk to you again in 2 months. Kristen, good job.
I didn't feel like I did as much as I should have, but I'm glad I was able to open the meeting up for Seth.
Yeah, I think
it came out really nice. Everything worked really well.
Great. Mel, I think is Mel still there? You took notes, I believe.
I'm still here, and there are some fantastic notes and lessons learned, I think. So I'll go ahead and compile those and send those back to the team here, Pepe. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you for doing that. I appreciate it.
Joe, thanks again for
Thanks,
recommending
guys.
TAV to us. And TAV, thank you for being with us.
And General Holmes, that's a great book. I mean, this book is amazing. I told guys at the Academy, every cadet should read this book. As a junior and senior, understand about leadership and solving hard problems in real time. And I think it's a great, to me, if I look at books about the Air Force history, A Few Great Captains is always my first book. I think this is a great segue from the Cold War to Vietnam. So I think it's an awesome book. Thanks for recommending that to us. I really enjoyed reading it. That's all I have from Olney. Boo, any comments from you?
Pepe, thank you again for running this whole thing with you and your team. And General Holmes, thank you for your participation in it. It was really a good book club today.
It was very interesting.
Very interesting.
All right. Well, I got an early morning tomorrow, so good night here from Olney. You guys take care.
Have a great 4th of July. Keep me
Thanks.
posted tomorrow, Pepe.
I will.
Okay.
Thank you. Thanks, Kristen.
All right. Happy 4th of July, guys.
Thank
too.
you.
Happy
Good night,
4th.
everyone.
Night.